In a quiet city where lives intersect but understanding often lags behind, a single afternoon in the park sets off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. Alicia Carter, a devoted mother and respected civil rights officer, is thrust into a nightmare when two police officers question her bond with her own children. A moment of unwarranted suspicion becomes the spark for a movement, igniting protests, exposing systemic bias, and challenging the very foundation of trust between a community and its protectors. But amidst the turmoil, unexpected kindness begins to emerge. A retired schoolteacher's unwavering support, a journalist's determined advocacy, and even a police officer's journey toward redemption weave together to create a story not just of conflict, but of transformation. As Alicia fights for justice, she discovers that change comes not only from grand gestures, but also from the small, quiet acts of compassion that ripple outward. Yet, the road ahead is far from certain, and the stakes couldn't be higher for her family, her city, and the future they all share. How do moments of pain lead to lasting progress? Can those responsible for harm become allies in healing? And how do courage and hope persist in the face of overwhelming odds? The warmth of the sun felt like a gentle embrace as Alicia Carter sat on a bench in Lincoln Park, her eyes fixed on her two children. Rebecca, 10 years old and brimming with energy, raced ahead, her blonde curls bouncing in the breeze. Her younger brother Tommy, 6 and slightly clumsy, chased her with determination, his giggles harmonizing with hers. The park was alive with laughter and chatter, families scattered across the open space. Yet Alicia felt a quiet sense of solitude. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, more for comfort than necessity, as her thoughts wandered. These moments with Rebecca and Tommy were rare and precious. Her job as a federal civil rights officer often demanded long hours, leaving little time for such outings. Still, she reminded herself to savor this day. Alicia's life had been anything but simple. As a single mother raising two children of different racial backgrounds, she often felt the weight of others' scrutiny. While she had grown used to the curious stares and whispered assumptions, it still stung. Today, however, she refused to let the world intrude on her peace. Rebecca darted toward the swings, her laughter ringing out. Tommy followed close behind, his arms outstretched as if to catch her shadow. Alicia smiled softly. For all the challenges she faced, her children were her anchor. Across the park, Officer Jason Harris sat in his patrol car, absently watching the scene. He took a sip from his coffee and frowned, something about the woman on the bench catching his eye. "Hey, Greg," he said, nudging his partner, Officer Greg Doyle, who was buried in the sports section of the newspaper. "What?" Doyle muttered without looking up. "That woman over there?" "With the kids," Harris said, nodding toward Alicia. "Something seems off." Doyle glanced up, squinting toward the bench. "What about her?" "She's black. And those kids?" "They're white," Harris said, his voice laced with suspicion. Doyle shrugged, already dismissing the observation. "Maybe she's their nanny. Happens all the time." "Maybe," Harris said slowly, though doubt lingered in his tone. "But it does not feel right." Harris's instincts were finely tuned from years on the force, often erring on the side of suspicion. Doyle, more seasoned and somewhat jaded, shook his head and returned to his paper. "You really want to stir the pot over this?" Doyle asked. Harris adjusted his belt and opened the car door. "We are just doing our job." Doyle sighed, but followed, knowing better than to argue. Together they crossed the park toward Alicia, their uniforms a sharp contrast against the greenery. Alicia noticed them immediately. Her body tensed as they approached, her mind racing through a dozen possibilities. She stood as they neared, instinctively placing herself between the officers and her children. Rebecca and Tommy, sensing her unease, stopped playing and edged closer. "Afternoon, ma'am," Harris began, his tone professional but firm. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" "Is there a problem?" Alicia asked, her voice calm but guarded. Harris gestured toward the children. "These your kids?" "Yes," Alicia replied firmly. Harris's eyes narrowed. "Do you have identification on you?" Alicia hesitated, her pulse quickening. "I do, but I do not see why I need to show it. I am here with my children, minding my own business." "It is just a routine check," Harris said, his patience thinning. Doyle crossed his arms, his stance making it clear that this was no simple request. Alicia reluctantly reached into her bag and handed over her ID. Harris studied it, his frown deepening. "Alicia Carter," he read aloud. "Address matches. But these kids? You sure they are yours?" Alicia's calm exterior cracked. "I have already told you they are my children. What more do you need?" Harris exchanged a look with Doyle, who gave a slight nod. "We are going to need you to come with us for further questioning," Harris said, pulling out his handcuffs. "What?" Alicia's voice rose, her shock giving way to anger. "You cannot be serious. In front of my children?" Rebecca clung to her mother's leg, tears welling in her eyes. "Mommy, what is happening?" she whispered. "It is going to be okay," Alicia said, her voice shaking but resolute. She looked directly at Harris. "You are making a mistake." Harris did not waver. He cuffed her hands behind her back as Doyle ushered the crying children a few steps away. Phones emerged from pockets as bystanders began recording the scene. Whispers turned to murmurs, and a sense of unease rippled through the park. "Mommy!" Tommy wailed as Alicia was led toward the patrol car. His small hands reached out, but Doyle gently blocked him. Alicia glanced back at her children, her heart breaking at their frightened faces. She felt the weight of judgment from strangers and the crushing reality of her situation. As Harris guided her into the back seat, she looked him in the eye. "You have no idea what you are doing," she said quietly. Harris did not respond. In his mind, he was doing his job. Yet, as he closed the door and the car pulled away, an unfamiliar pang of doubt settled in his chest. The park buzzed with activity as the video of the arrest began circulating online, igniting a spark that would soon become a firestorm. Meanwhile, Alicia sat in the back of the patrol car, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and resolve. She knew this was not just about her. It was about every person judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. Rebecca and Tommy were left standing with a kind bystander who promised to stay with them until Alicia could return. The woman knelt to their level, her soft voice soothing their cries. "It is going to be okay," she said gently, though even she seemed unsure. For Alicia, the fight was just beginning. As the patrol car wove through the city streets, she vowed to turn this moment of injustice into something that could not be ignored. Ethan Baker sat in a corner booth at Joe's coffee house, his laptop glowing faintly in the dim light. As a freelance journalist, he often found himself drawn to stories that stirred emotions and inspired reflection. He had not planned to cover anything significant that day, but the buzz on social media quickly changed his mind. A video taken at Lincoln Park was spreading rapidly, accompanied by captions like "racial profiling at its worst" and "mother arrested for sitting with her kids." Ethan clicked on the video, watching as two officers led a handcuffed black woman toward a patrol car, while two white children cried for her. The pain in their voices pierced through the screen, making Ethan's stomach churn. "Unbelievable," he muttered to himself. As he replayed the video, Ethan noticed details others might have missed: the calm but firm way the woman spoke to the officers, the way she shielded her children, and the unease in one officer's body language. This was not just another arrest. It was a story begging to be told. Ethan grabbed his bag and headed toward the police station, determined to learn more. The police station buzzed with activity. Reporters were already gathering outside, their questions bouncing off the walls as they jostled for position. Inside, Alicia Carter sat on a cold bench in the holding area, her hands still cuffed behind her back. She stared at the floor, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts. Her children, their cries, the humiliation, the disbelief. "Stay strong," she whispered to herself. It was a mantra she had used during hard times, but today it felt paper-thin. The holding area door swung open, and a uniformed officer gestured for her to follow. She stood, lifting her chin as she was led down a narrow hallway to a small interrogation room. A clock ticked on the wall, its sound filling the silence as she waited. Her thoughts turned to Rebecca and Tommy. Were they safe? Did anyone stay with them? She swallowed hard, refusing to let her fear show. The door opened, and Officers Harris and Doyle entered. Harris hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her. Doyle leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," Harris began, his tone professional but strained, "we need to ask you a few questions." "I have already answered your questions," Alicia said firmly. "I told you my name. I told you these are my children. What more do you want?" Doyle scoffed. "Lady, we are trying to figure out what is really going on here." Alicia's eyes narrowed. "What is going on is that you saw a black woman with white children and assumed the worst. You did not stop to think. You did not ask the right questions. You just acted." Harris shifted in his seat, her words striking a nerve. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. Another officer entered, holding a phone. "Officer Harris," he said, glancing at Alicia. "You might want to see this." Harris took the phone, his face tightening as he read the screen. It was the viral video. The comments were brutal, accusing him and Doyle of racism, incompetence, and worse. His stomach knotted, but he pushed the phone aside and focused on Alicia. "This is not about race," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We are just doing our job." "Your job?" Alicia repeated, her voice rising. "Your job is to protect and serve, not humiliate and terrorize. My children are terrified, and I do not even know where they are right now." Harris felt a pang of guilt, but Doyle's scoff cut through the tension. "Save the speech," Doyle said dismissively. "You can explain it to the judge." Before Alicia could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was a man in plain clothes, with a press badge dangling from his neck. "Ethan Baker," he said, introducing himself. "I am here to speak with Ms. Carter." "This is a private matter," Doyle snapped. "Press is not allowed in here." "Actually," Ethan countered, his tone sharp, "public accountability is very much allowed, and this situation has already gone public." Harris sighed, motioning for Doyle to follow him outside. They left the room, leaving Alicia and Ethan alone. "Ms. Carter," Ethan began, sitting across from her. "I saw the video. I wanted to make sure your story is told accurately." Alicia studied him for a moment, unsure whether to trust him. The exhaustion in her eyes softened as she realized he was her best chance to cut through the noise. "I was sitting in the park with my kids," she said. "Rebecca and Tommy. We were just playing. Then those officers came. They asked questions, but they did not want answers. They already decided I was guilty." Ethan nodded, scribbling notes as she spoke. "What do you want people to know?" "That this is not just about me," Alicia said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. "It is about the assumptions people make, the harm it causes, and the system that allows it." "Do you mind if I write your story?" Ethan asked. "It could help shine a light on what happened here." Alicia hesitated, but then nodded. "Do it. People need to know." By the time Ethan's article was published that evening, it had already gained traction. Titled, "A Mother's Pain: The Arrest of Alicia Carter," it detailed the events of the day with empathy and precision. Ethan included quotes from Alicia, descriptions of the officers' actions, and the cries of Rebecca and Tommy. He ended with a powerful question: how many more times will we let our biases lead us astray? The article spread like wildfire, shared by activists, celebrities, and concerned citizens alike. Protests were planned, petitions were signed, and the hashtag Justice for Alicia began trending. At home, Alicia sat on her couch, her children finally asleep in their beds after hours of tearful reassurances. She scrolled through her phone, overwhelmed by the flood of messages, some hateful, most supportive. One message stood out, sent by an elderly woman named Ruth Miller. "Dear Ms. Carter," the message began. "I saw what happened to you, and my heart aches. I lived through the civil rights movement, and I know what it is like to be judged unfairly. You are not alone. Please stay strong. The world needs your voice." Alicia read the message twice, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. Someone understood. Someone cared. She typed a reply, her fingers trembling. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Your kindness means more than you know." As Alicia set her phone down, she felt a shift in her heart. The day had broken her in ways she could not yet fully grasp, but it had also ignited something deeper, a determination to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by prejudice. This was only the beginning. The morning air was heavy with tension as Alicia Carter stood by her living room window, staring out at the quiet street. The house felt still, almost stifling, as though it held its breath alongside her. Rebecca and Tommy sat on the couch behind her, their faces pale and tired from the stress of the previous day. They clung to each other, their usual laughter and energy replaced by uneasy silence. Alicia turned back to them and knelt, her hands resting gently on Tommy's small shoulders. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We'll get through this together." Tommy nodded, but his big blue eyes brimmed with confusion. "Why did they take you, Mommy? You didn't do anything wrong." Alicia's heart ached at the question. She wanted to shield her children from the harsh realities of the world, but now those realities had crashed into their lives like a wrecking ball. "Sometimes people make mistakes," she said carefully, "but we're going to show them the truth." Rebecca hugged her mother tightly, her voice trembling. "I was so scared." "I know, sweetie," Alicia whispered, holding her close. "But we're safe now." As the morning light filtered through the curtains, Alicia's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it, her stomach tightening as she saw the sheer number of notifications. Texts, emails, and calls poured in, many from unknown numbers. Some messages offered support, others were laced with hate. She focused on the positives: a neighbor offering to babysit, an old college friend promising to help, and a flood of comments from strangers who had seen Ethan Baker's article. Her thumb hovered over one notification. It was from Ruth Miller, the elderly woman whose kind message had touched her heart the night before. Alicia opened it. "Dear Ms. Carter," Ruth had written, "I want you to know that I'm here for you. If you need someone to talk to or a shoulder to lean on, don't hesitate to reach out. I know what it's like to feel alone in a fight, but you are not alone." Alicia felt a lump in her throat as she read the words. She took a deep breath and typed a response. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Your kindness gives me strength. I'd love to meet and talk if you're available." Later that day, Alicia met Ruth at a small cafe downtown. Ruth, a petite woman with soft gray hair and wise eyes, greeted her with a warm hug. Despite her frail frame, she radiated strength. "I'm so glad you reached out," Ruth said, leading Alicia to a table by the window. "I've been following everything, and I can't stop thinking about how brave you are." Alicia gave a faint smile. "I don't feel brave. I don't know what else to do." Ruth reached across the table and took Alicia's hand. "You're doing exactly what you need to do, standing tall, speaking the truth. That's bravery." The sincerity in Ruth's voice brought tears to Alicia's eyes, but she blinked them away. "It's hard. My kids are scared. I'm scared. And the hate, it's overwhelming." Ruth nodded knowingly. It is hard, but you're stronger than you think, and you have more people on your side than you realize. As they talked, Alicia learned about Ruth's own battles during the civil rights movement. She had marched, protested, and faced her share of hostility, but she had also witnessed the power of collective action and the kindness of strangers. "You remind me of the women I marched with back then," Ruth said, her eyes shining with admiration. "You have that fire, that resolve, and it's going to make a difference." For the first time since the arrest, Alicia felt a flicker of hope. Ruth's stories and encouragement gave her a new perspective. This fight wasn't just hers, it was part of a larger struggle, one she could help shape. Meanwhile, across town, the protest outside the police station swelled in size. What had started as a few dozen people with signs had grown into hundreds, their voices echoing through the streets. Chants of "Justice for Alicia" and "End racial profiling" filled the air, accompanied by the hum of news cameras capturing every moment. Inside the station, Officer Jason Harris sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The day's events had left him shaken, his confidence eroded by the wave of public backlash. He had seen the video, read the comments, and now he couldn't escape the gnawing guilt in his gut. "Still thinking about it?" Officer Greg Doyle asked, leaning against the door frame. His tone was casual, almost dismissive. Harris looked up, his expression grim. "How can I not? This is a mess, Greg. And maybe we got it wrong." Doyle snorted. "Don't start second-guessing yourself. We did our job." She was acting suspicious. "Was she?" Harris shot back, his frustration evident. "Or did we assume she was because of how it looked?" Doyle's face hardened. "Don't let them get into your head, Jason. You know how this works." But Harris wasn't convinced. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little they had actually known about Alicia before making their decision. His unease deepened as he glanced at the protesters outside, their signs and chants a constant reminder of the stakes. That evening, Ethan Baker returned to his desk, sorting through the flood of messages sparked by his article. The response was overwhelming stories from people who had experienced similar injustices, offers of support for Alicia, and demands for accountability from the police. Ethan sifted through the messages, looking for leads that could expand the story. One caught his eye. A local civil rights group was organizing a community meeting, inviting Alicia to speak. Ethan immediately reached out to Alicia, hoping she would agree to attend. The following night, Alicia stood before a packed room at the community center. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, their energy a mix of anger and hope. Ruth sat in the front row, her presence a comforting anchor. Alicia took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Yesterday my children and I were treated like criminals because of an assumption," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "An assumption that had nothing to do with who we are and everything to do with how we look." Her words resonated deeply, the crowd nodding in agreement. Alicia shared her story, weaving it with a broader call for change. She spoke about her children's fear, her own determination, and the need for a system that treated everyone with dignity and fairness. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ruth smiled proudly, while Ethan scribbled notes furiously, already planning his next article. Alicia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she saw the power of her voice and the strength of the community rallying around her. This was no longer just about her arrest. It was about justice, resilience, and the kindness that could turn strangers into allies. And it was only the beginning. The applause at the community center still echoed in Alicia's ears as she stepped outside into the cool night air. For the first time since her arrest, she felt something akin to relief. The weight on her chest had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, replaced by a sense of purpose. Around her, the crowd lingered, many offering words of encouragement and solidarity. "You spoke beautifully tonight," Ruth Miller said, her soft voice cutting through the murmur of voices. She placed a reassuring hand on Alicia's arm. You gave them something to believe in. Alicia smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident, but her resolve unshaken. I just hope it's enough. It's hard not to feel overwhelmed. It is, Ruth said, her kind eyes meeting Alicia's. But remember, you're not alone. This fight is bigger than you, and that's why you'll win. The next morning, the city awoke to headlines and news reports buzzing with Alicia's story. Ethan Baker's second article, One Mother's Voice, A Call for Justice, captured the energy of the community meeting and amplified Alicia's message. He painted her as more than a victim, he framed her as a leader. The piece gained national attention, drawing support from civil rights organizations, public figures, and ordinary citizens across the country. Hashtags like Justice for Alicia and End Racial Profiling continued to trend, turning her personal ordeal into a rallying cry for change. Meanwhile, Alicia returned to the reality of her daily life. As she prepared breakfast for Rebecca and Tommy, she struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy. The children, though resilient in their own ways, were still grappling with the events at the park. "Mommy?" Rebecca asked cautiously, pushing her cereal around in the bowl. "Why do people think we don't belong together?" Alicia paused, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the carton of milk. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people make judgments because they don't understand. They see things that are different and assume something is wrong." "But we're not wrong," Rebecca said firmly, her eyes bright with innocence and defiance. Alicia knelt beside her, brushing a hand through her daughter's curls. "No, sweetheart, we're not, and that's why we have to show them the truth." Tommy, sitting quietly, piped up, "Are we going to tell the police they were wrong?" Alicia sighed, hugging him gently. "We're already doing that, buddy, and we're going to keep trying until they understand." Across town, Officer Jason Harris sat at his kitchen table, a half-eaten slice of toast on his plate. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on him. The articles, the protests, and Alicia's speech had all forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his actions. His partner, Greg Doyle, had dismissed it all as noise. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," Doyle had said the night before. "We did what we were supposed to do. End of story." But for Harris, it wasn't that simple. He couldn't shake the look in Alicia's eyes or the cries of her children. He had seen her speak at the community meeting, he had watched the live stream out of morbid curiosity, and her words had hit him harder than he expected. "We didn't want answers," she had said. "We wanted to confirm what we already believed." Harris rubbed his temples, the guilt gnawing at him. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his instincts had truly been his guide, or whether they had been tainted by bias. Later that afternoon, Ethan Baker called Alicia. His voice crackled with excitement over the line. "Alicia, I just got word that the mayor wants to meet with you." Alicia nearly dropped the phone. "The mayor? Why?" "I think she's feeling the pressure," Ethan said. "The protests, the media coverage, it's forcing her hand. This could be a big step toward reform." Alicia hesitated. The idea of sitting across from someone in power felt daunting, but Ruth's words rang in her mind. "This fight is bigger than you." "When?" Alicia asked, her voice steady. "Tomorrow," Ethan replied. "I'll be there to support you." The mayor's office was a stark contrast to the streets outside, where protesters chanted and waved signs. Inside, the air was quiet and polished, the walls lined with framed photos and certificates. Mayor Susan Greenfield, a composed woman in her 50s, rose from her desk to greet Alicia. Her handshake was firm, but not overly warm. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming," she said, motioning to a chair. Alicia sat, her back straight, her nerves hidden beneath a mask of composure. Ethan took a seat beside her, his notepad ready. "I want to start by saying I've been following your case closely," the mayor began. "What happened to you and your children was unacceptable, and I'm committed to finding solutions." Alicia tilted her head slightly. "Solutions are good, but we need more than promises. What concrete steps are you willing to take?" The mayor nodded, her expression serious. "We're drafting plans to establish a civilian oversight board for the police department. It would include independent members from the community who can review complaints and hold officers accountable." "That's a start," Alicia said. "But what about training? Officers need to understand the biases they carry and how those biases affect their decisions." "We're working on that as well," the mayor assured her. "We want mandatory bias training for all officers and a transparent process for addressing misconduct." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, Alicia refusing to back down from her demands. By the end, the mayor appeared both impressed and slightly overwhelmed by Alicia's determination. "I'll keep you updated as we move forward," the mayor said as they stood to leave. "Thank you," Alicia said, her voice calm but firm, "but I'll be watching closely." That evening, as Alicia returned home, she found another message from Ruth waiting in her inbox. "I'm so proud of you, Alicia. You're doing what so many people only dream of, using your voice to make real change. Keep going. The world needs more people like you." Alicia smiled, the weight of the day lifting slightly. She thought of Rebecca and Tommy, their trust in her unwavering. She thought of Ruth, a stranger-turned ally, and she thought of Harris, wondering if he too could change. For the first time in days, Alicia felt the stirrings of hope. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a chance to reshape the future, and she was ready to see it through. The glow of the streetlights illuminated Alicia's modest home as she tucked Rebecca and Tommy into bed. The day's events had left her drained, but she couldn't ignore the spark of hope ignited during her meeting with the mayor. As she smoothed Rebecca's curls and kissed Tommy's forehead, she thought about the burden of this fight. It was heavy, but it wasn't hers alone to carry anymore. "Mommy, are the police still mad at you?" Tommy asked, his small voice trembling. Alicia sat on the edge of the bed and held his tiny hand in hers. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "They made a mistake, and now they're learning from it. Sometimes, even grown-ups have to learn." Rebecca chimed in from her side of the room. "Are you scared, Mommy?" Alicia hesitated before answering. "A little," she admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are." Rebecca's eyes glimmered with understanding, and she pulled her blanket tighter around her. "You're brave, Mommy." Alicia smiled, blinking back tears. "And so are you." The following morning, Officer Jason Harris sat across from two internal affairs investigators in a cold, sterile room at the police station. The air felt heavy, the walls closing in as the investigators' sharp questions cut through the silence. "Officer Harris," one investigator said, her tone firm but even, "walk us through your reasoning on the day of Ms. Carter's arrest." Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We observed a situation that seemed unusual. A black woman with 2 white children. It wasn't typical." "Unusual how?" the investigator pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Did Ms. Carter exhibit any behavior that suggested a crime was being committed?" Harris hesitated. "Not explicitly, no, but the situation felt suspicious." The investigator exchanged a glance with her colleague before speaking again. "So, you acted based on a feeling?" Harris bristled. "We were doing our job. We asked for her ID, and while everything checked out, it still didn't seem right?" the other investigator interrupted, his tone sharp. "And that was enough to escalate the situation?" Harris lowered his gaze, his defenses crumbling under the weight of their questions. "I thought we were protecting the children." "And did the children appear in danger?" the first investigator asked. Harris thought of Rebecca and Tommy's tear-streaked faces. His throat tightened. "No." The investigators nodded, their pens scratching against their notepads. "Thank you, Officer Harris. That will be all for now." As Harris left the room, His mind swirled with regret. He had joined the force to protect people, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had caused more harm than good. Across town, Alicia sat at a cafe with Ethan Baker. The journalist had been a steadfast ally, helping to amplify her voice and keep the momentum of her story alive. Today, however, his focus was more personal. "You've become the face of this movement, Alicia," Ethan said, sipping his coffee. "How are you holding up?" Alicia exhaled, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "I'm trying. It's not just about me, though. It's about my kids, my community, everyone who's been treated unfairly. That's what keeps me going." Ethan nodded. "You're inspiring a lot of people. Have you thought about what's next?" Alicia shrugged. "Honestly, I'm taking it one day at a time. The meeting with the mayor felt like progress, but I know there's still a long way to go." "Speaking of progress," Ethan said, leaning in slightly, "I heard from a source that Officer Harris has been struggling with how things played out. Apparently, he's been questioning his actions." Alicia's expression softened. "Really?" "I think he's starting to understand the impact of his decisions," Ethan said. "If he reached out, would you be willing to talk to him?" The question lingered between them. Alicia's initial instinct was to refuse. After all, Harris had been a part of her humiliation. But the memory of Ruth's words echoed in her mind. "This fight is bigger than you." "I'd consider it," Alicia said carefully. "If he's genuinely willing to listen and learn, then maybe something good can come from it." Later that day, Harris sat in his car outside the community center where Alicia had spoken. The memory of her speech played on a loop in his mind, each word striking a chord he hadn't known existed. He reached for his phone and stared at the number Ethan Baker had given him. His thumb hovered over the call button, doubt gnawing at him. What could he possibly say to make things right? Summoning his courage, he pressed the button. The phone rang twice before Ethan answered. "This is Ethan." "Hi, this is Jason Harris," he said, his voice tight with nerves. "I was wondering if you could help me arrange a meeting with Alicia Carter." There was a pause on the other end. "That depends," Ethan said. "Are you ready to listen, or are you looking to justify yourself?" "I just want to listen," Harris said quietly. "I need to." 2 days later, Alicia sat in a small conference room at a local community center. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Her heart raced as she waited. The door opened, and Harris entered, his posture stiff, but his expression open. He stopped a few feet away from her, unsure how to begin. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady but low. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Alicia nodded, her eyes scanning his face. "Why did you want to meet?" Harris hesitated before speaking. "Because I need to apologize. I made assumptions about you that weren't fair or justified. And I realize now that those assumptions caused a lot of pain for you, for your children. I was wrong." Alicia's gaze softened, though her guard remained up. "What made you change your mind?" Harris took a deep breath. "Hearing you speak at the community meeting, seeing the impact of what I did, it's hard to admit, but I acted on bias. I thought I was protecting those kids, but I didn't stop to see the whole picture." Alicia studied him for a long moment before responding. "Apologizing is a start, but it's not enough. If you truly want to make amends, you need to work on changing the system that allowed this to happen." Harris nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will. I don't know how yet, but I will." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared acknowledgement filling the room. For the first time, Alicia felt a small flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of change. As Harris left the room, he felt a strange mix of relief and determination. He had taken the first step, but he knew it was only the beginning. For Alicia, the meeting reaffirmed her belief that even the most broken systems could be repaired one person at a time. The early morning sun cast long shadows as Alicia walked through her neighborhood with a grocery bag in hand. The events of the past week had transformed her once quiet life into a whirlwind of protests, meetings, and interviews. Though she felt the strain of it all, she clung to moments of normalcy, like running errands and preparing meals for Rebecca and Tommy. Her mind was preoccupied with thoughts of her meeting with Officer Harris. His apology had felt genuine, but she couldn't let herself dwell too much on it. She had to focus on the larger fight for reform. Turning a corner, she spotted Ruth Miller struggling with several bags of groceries. The older woman, who had become a quiet source of strength for Alicia, appeared frail as she tried to steady her grip. "Mrs. Miller!" Alicia called out, hurrying over. "Let me help you with those." Ruth looked up, her face brightening. "Alicia, dear, you're a lifesaver." Alicia took the heaviest bags and offered Ruth her arm. Together, they made their way toward Ruth's small bungalow, nestled at the edge of the neighborhood. The walk was slow, but filled with warm conversation. Inside, Ruth gestured for Alicia to set the bags on the kitchen counter. The home was cozy, filled with photos and mementos from a life well lived. A framed picture of Ruth standing at a civil rights march caught Alicia's eye. "You were there," Alicia said, pointing to the photo. Ruth followed her gaze and nodded. "Selma, 1965. I was just a school teacher then, but I couldn't stay silent. I had to stand up for what was right." Alicia felt a pang of admiration. What was it like? "Terrifying and exhilarating," Ruth said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "We faced so much hatred, but we also saw incredible kindness. People standing together, lifting each other up. It reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's always light." Alicia leaned against the counter, letting Ruth's words sink in. "I feel like I'm standing in that darkness now, trying to find the light." Ruth placed a gentle hand on Alicia's arm. "You're not alone, my dear. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence, courage, and a whole lot of faith." That afternoon, Alicia returned home feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Rebecca and Tommy greeted her at the door, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "Mommy, can we go to the park?" Tommy asked, his eyes hopeful. Alicia hesitated. The thought of returning to the park brought a wave of anxiety, but she saw the longing in her children's faces and realized that reclaiming their joy was just as important as fighting for justice. "Okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's go." The park was bustling with families, children's laughter mingling with the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Alicia sat on a bench watching as Rebecca and Tommy played on the swings. Though her heart ached with residual fear, she refused to let it take this moment away from her kids. As she sat there, a familiar figure approached. Jason Harris, dressed casually in jeans and a sweatshirt, stopped a few feet away, his expression hesitant. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice careful. Alicia looked up, surprised but composed. "Officer Harris." "Just Jason," he said quickly, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench. "Mind if I sit?" She nodded, though her guard remained up. "I didn't mean to intrude," he began, his hands clasped nervously. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Alicia studied him for a moment before answering. "We're managing. My kids are resilient, but this hasn't been easy for them." Harris nodded, guilt flickering across his face. "I can only imagine, and I'm sorry for what I put them through." They sat in silence for a while, the distant sound of children playing, filling the gap between them. "Why are you really here, Jason?" Alicia asked finally. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, "about changing the system. I want to be part of that change, but I don't know where to start." Alicia tilted her head, her skepticism softening. "It starts with listening, learning, acknowledging the harm that's been done, and working to fix it." "I'm ready to do that," he said earnestly. I've been volunteering at community events, trying to build trust, but it feels like I have so much to make up for. Change isn't about fixing everything at once, Alicia said. It's about consistent effort. Small steps lead to big strides. Harris nodded, her words sinking in. Thank you, Alicia, for giving me a chance to do better. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Alicia gathered Rebecca and Tommy and headed home. Her conversation with Jason lingered in her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that people could change not just individuals, but the system they were part of. Meanwhile, across the city, Greg Doyle sat in his car, scrolling through his phone. The backlash from Alicia's arrest had only intensified, and while Harris had begun to reflect on his actions, Doyle remained defiant. "They're blowing this way out of proportion," he muttered to himself, tossing the phone aside. He didn't see his actions as wrong, only misunderstood. But as the days passed and the protests grew louder, Doyle began to feel the weight of isolation. His colleagues avoided him, the public scorned him, and his own conviction in his actions began to waver. That evening, Alicia sat at her dining table with Rebecca and Tommy, helping them with their homework. The normalcy of the moment brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. Her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Ruth. "Dear Alicia," the message began, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. Seeing you stand strong inspires me every day. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us. Keep going, my dear. The world is watching, and they see your strength." Alicia smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Ruth's kindness, Jason's willingness to change, and the community's support reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but with every act of kindness, every step toward understanding, the darkness felt a little less overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, Alicia slept soundly, knowing that light was breaking through. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of Alicia's home. She stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring out at the street. The neighborhood was coming to life, kids waiting for the school bus, neighbors walking their dogs, but Alicia felt detached from it all. Her focus was on the day ahead, knowing it carried the weight of progress or setback. She had agreed to speak again at a community meeting, this time hosted by a coalition of local activists and city leaders. The mayor had confirmed her attendance, and Jason Harris had reached out, asking if he could attend to listen and learn. Alicia had hesitated but eventually agreed. She believed in giving people a chance, but she also knew she had to tread carefully. Jason Harris spent the morning in his apartment, pacing the small living room as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. Meeting Alicia at the park had been humbling, but it had also been a turning point. For years, he had believed that being a good cop was enough. Now he realized that complacency was part of the problem. "I need to do more," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. The community meeting felt like the next step, though he couldn't shake the nerves gnawing at him. He knew he would be walking into a room filled with people who distrusted him, perhaps even despised him. But if he wanted to earn back their trust, he had to show up. The community center was buzzing with energy by the time Alicia arrived. The room was packed with activists, city officials, and concerned citizens. Signs reading, "Justice for Alicia and Reform," now decorated the walls. A podium stood at the front of the room, flanked by folding chairs where the speakers would sit. Alicia spotted Ruth Miller in the crowd, her warm smile a steadying force. She also saw Ethan Baker, notepad in hand, ready to capture every moment. As Alicia took her seat on the panel, she felt the familiar rush of nerves mixed with determination. The mayor arrived shortly after, her presence commanding attention. Jason slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. His plain clothes made him blend in, but his face was unmistakable to anyone who had seen the viral video. The meeting began with speeches from local leaders, each emphasizing the need for accountability and reform. When Alicia's turn came, the room fell silent. She stepped to the podium, her hands gripping the edges as she surveyed the crowd. I stand here today not just for myself, but for every person who has been judged, dismissed, or wronged because of how they look, Alicia began, her voice steady. This fight is not about blame, it's about building something better. She shared her story again, but this time she wove it into a broader call for action. She spoke about the Civilian Oversight Board, mandatory bias training, and the importance of community police relationships. We cannot move forward without trust, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. And trust starts with accountability. It starts with listening. The audience erupted in applause, many standing in solidarity. Alicia stepped back, her chest rising and falling as she absorbed the support. After the speeches, the meeting transitioned into a discussion. Attendees took turns sharing their experiences, frustrations, and hopes. Jason sat quietly, listening intently as people described the pain caused by a system that seemed stacked against them. Finally, he raised his hand. The room stilled as he stood, his face taut with emotion. "I'm Jason Harris," he began, his voice shaky. "I was one of the officers who arrested Ms. Carter." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jason pressed on. "I want to say that I was wrong. I made assumptions that day, assumptions that were rooted in bias, whether I realized it or not, and those assumptions caused harm." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to listen and to learn. I want to be better, not just as a police officer, but as a person. And I want to be part of the solution." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Alicia watched him carefully, searching his face for sincerity. She saw it, the raw vulnerability of someone trying to make amends. Ruth Miller was the first to speak. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said, her voice strong. "But words are only the beginning. Action is what matters." Jason nodded. "I agree. That's why I've started volunteering at community programs. I'm also working with my department to push for better training. It's not enough, but it's a start." The room slowly warmed to him, some nodding in approval. Others remained skeptical, their arms crossed in silent judgment. Alicia understood their hesitation. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. After the meeting, Jason approached Alicia, his hands tucked nervously in his pockets. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "It meant a lot." Alicia studied him for a moment before replying. "You took a big step today, but there's still a long way to go." "I know," Jason said, "and I'm committed to taking it." Later that evening, Alicia sat on her porch, the cool breeze carrying the sounds of the neighborhood. Rebecca and Tommy were asleep, their laughter from earlier still echoing in her mind. She held her phone, rereading a message from Ruth. "You're planting seeds of change, Alicia. It takes time for them to grow, but you're making it happen. Keep going." Alicia set the phone down and leaned back, letting the words wash over her. She thought about Jason's apology, Ruth's wisdom, and the community that had rallied behind her. She thought about the future she wanted for Rebecca and Tommy, a future where they wouldn't have to fight the same battles. For the first time in weeks, Alicia felt a glimmer of peace. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. And as long as she had the strength to keep going, she would. The city's momentum toward reform felt like a fragile spark, flickering, but alive. Alicia woke the next morning to messages from the mayor's office. The Civilian Oversight Board proposal had been formally drafted and would be presented to the city council later that week. Alicia had been invited to speak as a community representative. Sitting at her kitchen table, Alicia scrolled through the email, a mixture of pride and apprehension swirling inside her. She had always been a fighter, but this was new territory, political, public, and deeply personal. Rebecca wandered into the room, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mommy, are you going to talk to the people on TV again?" Alicia chuckled, pulling her daughter into her lap. "Something like that. It's called the City Council, and they're the ones who make decisions about how our city works." "Are you going to tell them to be nice?" Rebecca asked innocently. Alicia kissed the top of her head. "Something like that, sweetie." The city council meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, but in the days leading up to it, Alicia threw herself into preparation. Ruth Miller came by to help, her presence as steadying as ever. "You're going to do fine," Ruth said, placing a hand on Alicia's shoulder. "Just speak from the heart, like you always do." Alicia smiled faintly, though her nerves were obvious. "This feels different, Ruth, bigger. I'm not sure my words will be enough." Ruth shook her head firmly. "Alicia, your words have already started something. This council meeting is just the next step. The seeds you've planted are taking root." The words comforted Alicia, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on her. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. Meanwhile, Officer Jason Harris was navigating his own journey. Encouraged by his interactions with Alicia and the community meeting, he reached out to a local organization that offered training on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques for law enforcement. The sessions were eye-opening. As Jason sat through workshops, he listened to stories from people who had been unfairly targeted by police. Each account chipped away at the wall he had built around himself, forcing him to confront the ways his actions had contributed to a system of harm. He began volunteering at youth outreach programs, showing up in plain clothes to mentor kids and foster trust. While the road ahead felt daunting, Jason was determined to prove that change was possible, even for him. The night of the city council meeting arrived, and the chamber was packed. Activists, community members, and city officials filled the seats, while reporters lined the back of the room. Alicia sat near the front, flanked by Ruth and Ethan. The mayor opened the session with a brief overview of the Civilian Oversight Board proposal, explaining its goals and mechanisms. Then she introduced Alicia as the final speaker of the night. As Alicia approached the podium, the room fell silent. Her heart raced, but she kept her chin high and her voice steady. "Good evening," she began, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "My name is Alicia Carter, and I stand before you as a mother, a professional, and a citizen who believes in the power of change." She paused, scanning the room. "A few weeks ago, my children and I experienced an injustice that no family should have to endure. That experience, though painful, has brought us here tonight. It's a reminder that change often comes from the hardest moments." Alicia spoke about the importance of accountability, the need for trust between police and the communities they serve, and the long overdue reforms that could prevent what happened to her from happening to others. "We're not here to tear anyone down," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "We're here to build something better, a system that treats everyone with dignity, fairness, and humanity." Her words were met with a standing ovation. The applause thundered through the chamber, bringing tears to Alicia's eyes. As she stepped away from the podium, Ruth squeezed her hand and whispered, "You did it." The council voted unanimously to approve the Oversight Board proposal, and the announcement sent a ripple of relief and triumph through the community. News outlets reported the story as a victory for grassroots activism, crediting Alicia's leadership and determination. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. Alicia was invited to help shape the structure of the Oversight Board, ensuring it had real authority and representation from diverse voices. She worked tirelessly, balancing her new responsibilities with caring for Rebecca and Tommy. Jason, too, continued his efforts to rebuild trust. He partnered with community leaders to host forums where residents could voice their concerns and offer suggestions for improvement. Each interaction, though humbling, strengthened his resolve. One evening, As Alicia was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Hi, Alicia. I just wanted to say thank you. Your words at the council meeting really moved me. You're making a difference, and I'm grateful to be learning from you." Alicia stared at the message for a moment before replying, "Thank you, Jason. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. Keep going." That weekend, Ruth invited Alicia and her children over for tea. They sat in Ruth's cozy living room, sipping chamomile and sharing stories. "You've come so far in such a short time," Ruth said, her voice warm with pride. "Do you realize what you've accomplished?" Alicia shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "It doesn't feel like enough yet." "It never does," Ruth said with a chuckle. "But that's the beauty of it. You keep going, because the work is never done." Rebecca, perched on the couch beside Ruth, looked up curiously. "What work, Mrs. Miller?" "The work of making the world better, dear," Ruth said, ruffling the girl's hair. "And your mommy is very good at it." Rebecca beamed, and Alicia felt her heart swell. As the evening wore on, Alicia realized that Ruth was right. The seeds of change had been planted, and though the journey was far from over, those seeds were beginning to grow. The morning after Ruth's tea gathering, Alicia woke to the sound of laughter drifting from the living room. She smiled, recognizing Rebecca's animated giggles and Tommy's delighted squeals. For a brief moment, the weight she had been carrying felt lighter. She joined her children and found them building a fort out of blankets and couch cushions. Rebecca turned to her with a triumphant grin. "Mommy, look, it's a castle!" Tommy popped his head out from underneath a blanket, his face glowing with pride. "You can be the queen, Mommy." Alicia knelt to their level, embracing them both. "It's perfect," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. These moments of joy reminded her why she fought so hard. The approval of the Civilian Oversight Board had sent ripples through the city. Meetings were held to outline its structure, and Alicia was invited to sit on the advisory committee. The board was designed to include members from various communities, ensuring a diversity of perspectives. It would also oversee independent investigations into claims of police misconduct and recommend reforms. Alicia attended the first official meeting that week. The room buzzed with the energy of possibility, a mix of community leaders, activists, and legal experts seated around the table. Mayor Greenfield began the session. "This is a significant step forward for our city," she said, addressing the group. "But it's just the beginning. We need to ensure this board is not only functional, but impactful. That starts with all of you." Alicia felt the weight of responsibility as she listened to the mayor's words. She contributed her ideas with confidence, drawing from her own experiences and the conversations she had had with her community. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Alicia's voice carried weight. Jason Harris was also navigating a new path. After weeks of self-reflection and community engagement, he approached his department's leadership with an idea. He proposed a pilot program that would focus on bias training, de-escalation tactics, and fostering relationships between officers and residents. To his surprise, the proposal was met with cautious approval. "If you believe in this, Harris," his captain said, "then you need to lead it." Jason felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Leading such a program meant putting himself in a vulnerable position, but he was determined to see it through. He reached out to Alicia, hoping for her guidance. One evening, Alicia received Jason's message. "Hi, Alicia. I've proposed a program to my department focusing on bias training and community engagement. I'd really appreciate your input if you're willing." She stared at the screen, her initial reaction one of skepticism. Could someone from inside the system really drive meaningful change? But then she thought of Ruth's wisdom. Seeds of change take time to grow. "I'd be happy to help," she replied. The following weekend, Jason and Alicia met at the community center to discuss the program. Jason arrived early, carrying a notebook filled with ideas and questions. He was surprised when Alicia walked in with Rebecca and Tommy in tow. "I hope you don't mind," Alicia said. "It's hard to find a sitter on short notice." Jason smiled warmly. "Not at all. It's good to see them." Rebecca and Tommy shyly waved before settling at a table with coloring books Alicia had brought along. As they discussed Jason's proposal, Alicia's initial skepticism began to fade. He was earnest, open to feedback, and committed to making a difference. "This could really work," she said, nodding as she read through his notes. "But it needs to be more than a training program. It needs to foster real connections between officers and the community." Jason jotted down her suggestions. "What do you think about involving local leaders in the training sessions? People who can share their experiences directly with the officers." "I think that's a great idea," Alicia said, "and it's something I can help with." By the time their meeting ended, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Greg Doyle's path had taken a very different turn. His defiance and refusal to acknowledge his role in Alicia's arrest had isolated him, both within the department and in the public eye. The internal investigation into the incident concluded that his actions reflected a pattern of poor judgment. Faced with mounting pressure, Doyle resigned from the force. For Alicia, hearing the news brought mixed emotions. While she was glad to see accountability, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Doyle's fall was a stark reminder of how resistance to growth could lead to self-destruction. A few weeks later, the City Council held a public ceremony to announce the official formation of the Civilian Oversight Board. The event was held at the city's main plaza, a vibrant space filled with community members, activists, and city officials. Alicia was invited to speak, along with the mayor and other key leaders. Standing on the stage, she looked out at the crowd and felt a swell of hope. "This board represents more than oversight," Alicia said. "It represents progress, trust, and a commitment to doing better. We are not just holding people accountable, we are building a future where fairness and humanity guide our decisions." The crowd erupted in applause. Among them, Alicia spotted Ruth, Ethan, and Jason. Their support bolstered her as she stepped away from the podium, knowing that this victory was just the beginning. That evening, Alicia returned home to find a letter from Ruth waiting in her mailbox. "Dear Alicia," it began. "I watched you today with so much pride. You've come so far, and I know this is just the start of the incredible work you'll do. Remember, progress is like a river, slow but powerful. Keep flowing, my dear. The world needs your strength." Alicia folded the letter carefully and placed it in her journal, a keepsake she had started to document her journey. She sat on the couch, watching Rebecca and Tommy play, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The seeds of change were growing, and while there was still much to do, Alicia was ready for whatever came next. The air was crisp with the first signs of autumn as Alicia walked to the community center with Rebecca and Tommy. The Oversight Board's first public meeting was being held that evening, and Alicia had been invited to observe and participate. For weeks, she had worked alongside city officials and activists to shape the board's structure, and now it was ready to begin its mission. "Are you going to talk to the police again, Mommy?" Rebecca asked as she skipped along beside her. "Not exactly," Alicia replied with a smile, "but we're going to listen to people share their stories. It's a way to help make things better." Tommy clutched her hand. "Will the bad police officers still be mean?" Alicia knelt, looking into her son's wide eyes. "We're working to make sure no one has to be scared, sweetheart. That's why we're doing this." Reassured, Tommy nodded, and the three continued their walk. The community center was bustling when they arrived. Rows of chairs filled the main hall, and a panel of oversight board members sat at a long table at the front. Alicia spotted familiar faces in the audience: Ruth Miller, Ethan Baker, and Jason Harris, who had become a regular at community events. Rebecca and Tommy joined a small group of children at a table set up with activities, leaving Alicia free to mingle. She felt the buzz of anticipation in the room, a sense that this was the start of something meaningful. Jason approached her, his expression calm but purposeful. "Alicia," he said, offering a small smile. "Good to see you here." "You too, Jason," she replied. "How's the program going?" "It's a work in progress," he admitted, "but we've had some great feedback from the community. I think we're starting to build trust." "That's good to hear," Alicia said, her tone warm. "Keep at it." Jason hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to thank you. None of this would have happened without you." Alicia met his gaze. "This isn't just me. It's everyone who stood up and spoke out, including you." Jason nodded, visibly moved by her words. As the meeting began, Alicia watched with quiet pride. Community members stepped forward to share their experiences, and the board members listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. For the first time, people had a platform to voice their concerns without fear of being dismissed. Ruth, who sat beside Alicia, leaned over and whispered, "Look at what you've helped create." Alicia smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. "It's a start," she whispered back. One of the speakers was a young man named Marcus, who recounted an experience eerily similar to Alicia's. He described being stopped and questioned without cause, his voice trembling with the memory of fear and humiliation. The board members assured him that his case would be reviewed, and his courage was met with applause from the audience. Alicia felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she fought to ensure stories like Marcus's were heard and addressed. After the meeting, Alicia stayed behind to help clean up. As she folded chairs and gathered stray papers, Ruth approached her, holding a letter in her hands. "I wrote this for you," Ruth said, her voice soft. "I thought it might help on the harder days." Alicia took the letter, her fingers brushing against Ruth's. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Later that night, after Rebecca and Tommy were asleep, Alicia sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's letter. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of Ruth's wisdom. "Dear Alicia, when I met you, I saw a strength in you that reminded me of the women I marched alongside all those years ago. You've faced trials that would break most people, yet you've risen with grace and determination. The work you've done, the oversight board, the trust you've rebuilt, the voices you've amplified has already made a difference. But I know the road ahead is long. There will be days when it feels like nothing is changing, when the weight of it all feels too much to bear. On those days, I want you to remember this. You are not alone. Every step you take, every fight you face, you are surrounded by people who believe in you and the world you're building. You've planted seeds of change, and though it takes time, they will grow. Keep going, Alicia. The world needs people like you. With love and admiration, Ruth Alicia wiped away tears as she finished reading. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her journal, alongside the other mementos of her journey. The weeks that followed brought more progress. The Oversight Board began investigating past cases of misconduct, and Jason's training program expanded, drawing praise from both officers and community members. Protests gave way to dialogues, and the city started to feel the first stirrings of unity. One afternoon, Alicia stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd gathered for a rally. Rebecca and Tommy stood beside her, their small hands gripping hers. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But this is just the beginning. Change is not a destination, it's a journey, and together we'll keep moving forward." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the city. Alicia felt a sense of peace and purpose she hadn't known before. She looked down at Rebecca and Tommy, their faces shining with pride, and knew that the world she was fighting for was already beginning to take shape. That evening, as the sun set and the city grew quiet, Alicia sat on her porch, watching Rebecca and Tommy chase fireflies in the yard. Jason had stopped by earlier to share news of another community event, and Ruth had called to check in. her voice as warm and steady as ever. Alicia leaned back, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she felt ready to face it. With every act of kindness, every step toward understanding, and every voice that joined hers, the seeds of change grew stronger. And for the first time in a long time, Alicia felt hope. True, unshakable hope. As Alicia sat under the glow of the porch light, watching Rebecca and Tommy chase fireflies, she thought about how far they had come. The challenges she faced were immense, but so were the moments of kindness, resilience, and unity that had carried her through. The journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but for now, she allowed herself to bask in the hope she had fought so hard to preserve. This story reminds us all that even in the face of adversity, kindness and perseverance can ignite change. Together, we can build a better world, one step, one voice, one act of courage at a time. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And for more stories like this story of resilience, hope, and the power of the human spirit, subscribe to our channel. Let's continue this journey together.